Elderly woman who is 100 gave birth to a miracle baby. What complications arise in this true story? How does this affect the life of the woman? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Nestled in the heart of Willowbrook, a quiet town that often seemed to stand still in time, lived Margaret Wilkins, the oldest resident of the community. At 100 years old, Margaret was the living embodiment of resilience. Her home, a creaky Victorian house adorned with wisteria vines, was a centerpiece of the town. Margaret herself was a constant source of fascination and inspiration, her stories stretching across a century of world-changing events, personal triumphs, and heartbreak. Margaret had lived a life filled with the extraordinary. She had witnessed 2 world wars, the invention of the internet, and the landing on the moon. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for what would come to define the twilight of her life: motherhood. The news of Margaret's pregnancy stunned the world. It had started as an inexplicable series of symptoms: nausea, fatigue, and peculiar cravings. At first, Margaret dismissed them as quirks of old age. But when her housekeeper, Lydia, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s with a penchant for herbal remedies, insisted she see a doctor, Margaret reluctantly agreed. Dr. Nathan Cole, the town's beloved physician, greeted her with skepticism. "Margaret," he chuckled as he reviewed her file, "you've outlived 3 of my predecessors. I think we'd notice if you were pregnant." But when the blood tests returned, Nathan's humor gave way to disbelief. The ultrasound technician, a young woman named Clara, almost dropped the probe when the screen revealed a tiny heartbeat. The room fell silent as Margaret stared at the monitor, her gnarled hands trembling. It's impossible," she whispered, tears welling up in her faded blue eyes. "Margaret, this is a miracle," Nathan said, his voice shaking. "But it's also incredibly high risk." The news spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. The townsfolk were divided. Some called it a gift from God, while others whispered rumors of scientific experiments or divine punishment. Margaret's estranged niece, Patricia, flew in from New York, accusing Nathan of malpractice and demanding answers. Meanwhile, Lydia stood steadfast by Margaret's side, warding off reporters and ensuring she had the support she needed. Complications began to arise almost immediately. Margaret's fragile body struggled under the strain of pregnancy. She developed gestational diabetes, and her blood pressure skyrocketed. Nathan assembled a team of specialists, including Dr. Emily Carter, a maternal-fetal medicine expert from Boston. Emily's arrival stirred tension. Her modern methods clashed with Nathan's traditional approach, creating friction in the treatment plan. As the months went by, the baby became a symbol of hope for some and a target of criticism for others. Margaret's closest friend, Eleanor, a sprightly 85-year-old with a sharp tongue, was one of her fiercest advocates. "If anyone can do this, it's Margaret," she declared at the town hall meeting that was ironically called to discuss Margaret's personal business. "She's tougher than all of you combined." Yet, not everyone was supportive. Pastor James, a stern and dogmatic figure, warned the congregation that this unnatural event was a test of faith. Margaret, who had long abandoned organized religion after losing her husband in the war, dismissed his remarks with a wave of her hand. "God has bigger things to worry about than my uterus," she quipped, earning a roar of laughter from Eleanor. As her belly grew, so did the complications. Margaret was placed on strict bed rest, her days filled with medical appointments and invasive tests. Lydia transformed the house into a makeshift clinic, her practicality and no-nonsense attitude proving invaluable. "You're going to make it, Margaret," she said firmly one evening, fluffing her pillows. "That baby isn't going to let you give up." But the journey wasn't without moments of doubt. Margaret often found herself staring at the nursery Lydia had prepared, wondering if she had made the right decision. One night, she confided in Nathan, her voice trembling. "What if I don't live long enough to raise this child? What kind of life would that be for them?" Nathan, who had grown deeply invested in her case, took her hand. "Margaret, you've already given this child the greatest gift, a chance to exist. None of us can predict the future, but what you're doing is extraordinary." The climax of Margaret's pregnancy arrived with the force of a summer storm. At 32 weeks, she was rushed to the hospital with preeclampsia. The entire town held its breath as Nathan and Emily worked together in a tense and delicate dance to save both Margaret and the baby. Lydia, Eleanor, and even Patricia camped out in the waiting room, their differences momentarily set aside in the face of the unfolding miracle. When the baby, a tiny but fierce girl named Grace, was delivered via emergency C-section, the room erupted into cheers and tears. Margaret, weak but determined, insisted on holding her daughter despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her. As she cradled Grace in her arms, the hospital room bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Margaret whispered, "You're my greatest adventure." The days following Grace's birth were a whirlwind of emotions, medical interventions, and unexpected challenges. Margaret remained in the hospital under constant observation, her frail body working tirelessly to recover from the ordeal of childbirth. Grace, born prematurely, was whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, where tiny miracles were performed daily to ensure her survival. She was a fighter, her cries, though soft, pierced the sterile walls of the NICU, a testament to her will to live. Lydia, ever the stalwart companion, rarely left Margaret's side. She had taken on the role of spokesperson, fielding questions from nosy reporters and concerned townsfolk. "They are both fighters," Lydia told a persistent journalist who had camped outside the hospital. "And if you think you can write a story about this family without their permission, you'll be hearing from me." Meanwhile, Eleanor rallied the community. She organized prayer circles, fundraisers, and meal trains, ensuring that Margaret's modest home was in order for her return. Despite her fiery exterior, Eleanor was deeply moved by the arrival of Grace. "I've lived long enough to see a lot of things," she said one evening, addressing a group of neighbors who had gathered to support Margaret. "But this is something sacred." Yet, not everyone in Willowbrook shared Eleanor's sentiment. Pastor James's sermons became more pointed, veiled in warnings about tempting nature and disrupting divine plans. His words emboldened a small but vocal group of townsfolk who viewed Margaret's pregnancy as an affront to tradition. The tension reached a boiling point when Patricia, who had initially flown in to protest Margaret's decision to keep the baby, found herself defending her aunt against a mob of protesters outside the hospital. "Have you no shame?" Patricia yelled, her New York accent cutting through the crowd. "That woman is 100 years old and just gave birth. If you can't respect that, then maybe you should look at your own lives before passing judgment." Patricia's unexpected shift in loyalty surprised even herself. As she spent more time with Margaret, she began to see the woman not as the eccentric aunt she had avoided for decades, but as a figure of immense courage and strength. Slowly, the barriers between them began to crumble, and Patricia found herself stepping into a role she never expected, that of a caregiver. Inside the hospital, Margaret's bond with Grace grew stronger with each passing day. Despite her weakened state, she insisted on making the long journey to the NICU, aided by Lydia or Patricia, to hold her daughter. The nurses, initially wary of Margaret's advanced age, were soon charmed by her unwavering determination and gentle humor. "You're spoiling her already," Nurse Claire teased one afternoon as Margaret hummed a lullaby to Grace. "She deserves to be spoiled," Margaret replied, her voice firm. "She's worked harder to be here than most people do in a lifetime." But the challenges were far from over. Grace's fragile health meant she was prone to infections and setbacks. One night, alarms blared in the NICU as Grace's oxygen levels plummeted. Margaret, confined to her hospital bed, was powerless to do anything but pray as the medical team worked to stabilize her baby. It was a harrowing reminder of how delicate their situation was, and it left Margaret questioning whether she had made the right choice in bringing Grace into the world. Dr. Emily Carter, who had been a pivotal figure in the pregnancy, became an unlikely source of comfort. Though initially clinical in her approach, Emily had grown deeply invested in Margaret's case. She often stopped by Margaret's room after her shifts, sharing updates about Grace and offering words of encouragement. "Margaret," Emily said one evening, pulling up a chair beside her bed, "you've already defied every expectation. Grace is stronger than she looks, and a lot of that is because of you." Margaret's eyes, tired but still bright, met Emily's. "You think she'll make it?" Emily smiled. "I don't just think it. I know it." Back in Willowbrook, the drama surrounding Margaret's unprecedented pregnancy continued to unfold. The local newspaper published a scathing editorial accusing the medical community of playing God. This sparked a fierce debate among the townsfolk, dividing the community even further. But for every critic, there was a supporter. A group of local mothers, inspired by Margaret's story, organized a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. Their message clear: life, in all its forms, was a miracle worth celebrating. As the weeks turned into months, Grace grew stronger. Her tiny body filled out, her cries became louder, and her eyes began to open, revealing a deep, piercing blue that mirrored Margaret's. The day she was discharged from the NICU was one of triumph and tears. Margaret, now confined to a wheelchair, cradled Grace in her arms as a crowd of well-wishers gathered outside the hospital to welcome them home. The transition to life at home was anything but smooth. Margaret's age and health presented constant challenges, and Grace's needs were overwhelming. Lydia and Patricia became an unlikely team, their contrasting personalities creating a balance that kept the household running. Lydia's no-nonsense practicality complemented Patricia's flair for improvisation, and together they ensured that both Margaret and Grace were cared for. Eleanor, ever the social butterfly, turned Margaret's home into a revolving door of visitors, each eager to meet the baby who had captured the heart of the town. Among them was Pastor James, who arrived one afternoon, hat in hand, to offer a begrudging apology. "I may have been wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with humility. "There's something undeniably holy about what you've done here." Margaret, holding Grace close, simply smiled. "It's never too late to see the light, Pastor." But as life settled into a new rhythm, a shadow loomed on the horizon. Margaret's health, already precarious, began to deteriorate. She was no longer able to leave her bed, and every breath seemed to take more effort than the last. Despite this, her spirit remained unbroken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the nursery, Margaret called Patricia to her side. "Promise me something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you'll give Grace the life I won't be here to see." Patricia, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "I promise, Aunt Margaret. She'll know how much you love her." Margaret smiled, her eyes closing as she cradled Grace one last time. "She's my greatest miracle," she whispered. "And so are you." The days that followed Margaret's heartfelt words were a mixture of quiet reflection and mounting dread. Her frailty became more evident with each passing hour, and the once vibrant woman who had defied all odds seemed to be slowly fading. Yet even in her weakened state, Margaret continued to radiate a sense of peace and fulfillment, as though she had made her peace with what was to come. Patricia, who had once viewed her aunt as a distant and eccentric figure, now found herself deeply entrenched in Margaret's world. Caring for both Margaret and Grace was a monumental task, but it was one Patricia took on with fierce determination. She had promised Margaret that Grace would have the life she deserved, and she intended to honor that promise no matter what. The townsfolk, who had once been divided over Margaret's pregnancy, began to rally around her. Lydia organized a rotating schedule of visitors, ensuring that Margaret was never alone. Eleanor became a constant presence, her sharp humor and unwavering loyalty providing comfort in the most challenging moments. "Margaret," Eleanor said one afternoon as she sat by her bedside, "you've managed to bring this town together in a way I never thought possible. Even Pastor James is singing your praises, though I wouldn't trust him to bake you a pie." Margaret chuckled weakly, her voice barely audible. "Well, miracles have a way of changing hearts." Grace, now a robust infant with a surprising amount of energy for her size, became a symbol of hope for everyone who met her. Despite her early struggles, she had grown into a healthy and curious baby, her piercing blue eyes always seeking out the world around her. Lydia often remarked that Grace was a reflection of Margaret's indomitable spirit, a living testament to the power of resilience and love. But as much as Grace thrived, Margaret's condition continued to decline. One night, as the house settled into its usual stillness, Margaret called for Patricia. Her voice, though faint, carried an urgency that Patricia couldn't ignore. Sitting at her aunt's bedside, Patricia listened as Margaret spoke with a clarity and conviction that belied her fragile state. "Patricia," she began, her hands trembling as she reached for her nieces. "I need you to tell Grace about me. Not just the stories, but the truth, every moment, every struggle, every triumph. She deserves to know where she came from." Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will, Aunt Margaret. She'll know everything." Margaret's gaze softened, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "And don't let Eleanor teach her how to gamble. She's a terrible influence." They both laughed softly, the sound bittersweet in the quiet room. Margaret's laughter soon gave way to a fit of coughing, and Patricia rushed to her side, her heart aching as she realized how little time they had left. The following morning, the sun rose over Willowbrook, casting a golden glow across Margaret's home. The house was quiet, save for the soft coos of Grace and the muffled sounds of Lydia preparing breakfast. Patricia sat by Margaret's bedside, holding her hand as the older woman slept peacefully. When Eleanor arrived later that morning, she immediately sensed the change in the air. Sitting down beside Patricia, she placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's ready," Eleanor said softly. "And we need to be ready too." As the day unfolded, friends and family came to say their goodbyes. Even Pastor James made an appearance, his once judgmental demeanor replaced by genuine sorrow. "She taught me more about faith than I ever thought possible," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. That evening, as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Margaret took her final breath. Surrounded by those who loved her most, she passed away with Grace cradled in her arms, a peaceful smile on her lips. It was a moment both heartbreaking and beautiful, a fitting end to a life that had defied all expectations. In the days that followed, the town of Willowbrook came together to celebrate Margaret's life. The funeral was a testament to the impact she had on the community, with people from all walks of life sharing stories of her wisdom, humor, and courage. Patricia, now the guardian of Grace, spoke with a newfound strength as she recounted the journey that had brought them all together. "Margaret Wilkins was more than just my aunt," Patricia said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "She was a force of nature, a woman who refused to let anything, not even age, define her. She taught us all what it means to live fully, to love deeply, and to embrace the miracles life gives us." As the years went by, Grace grew up hearing stories about her extraordinary mother. Patricia, true to her promise, ensured that Grace knew every detail of Margaret's life, from her struggles to her triumphs. Eleanor became a doting grandmother figure, teaching Grace everything from baking to the art of standing up for oneself. Lydia, ever the practical matriarch, took on the role of disciplinarian, ensuring that Grace remained grounded despite the adoration she received from the community. Grace, now a young woman with the same piercing blue eyes as her mother, often visited Margaret's grave, where a simple inscription read, "Margaret Wilkins, a life of love, courage, and miracles." One sunny afternoon, as she stood by the grave, Grace felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying on the breeze. "For everything." And though the wind offered no reply, Grace knew in her heart that Margaret's love would always be with her, a guiding force in the life her mother had fought so hard to give her. Grace's life was shaped by the legacy of her mother, Margaret, a legacy of resilience, love, and defying the odds. As she grew older, Grace began to feel the weight of the stories that surrounded her. To the people of Willowbrook, she wasn't just an ordinary child. She was the miracle baby, the daughter of the town's most extraordinary woman. By the time she reached her teenage years, Grace was already grappling with the duality of her existence. On one hand, she felt immense pride in being Margaret's daughter, knowing she had been born of a miraculous and unprecedented story. On the other hand, she struggled with the pressure of living up to the expectations of being the miracle child. Every mistake she made, every bad grade or misstep, seemed magnified under the weight of the town's collective gaze. It was Eleanor who first noticed the shift in Grace's demeanor. Eleanor, who by now was nearing 90 herself, still possessed the same sharp wit and unyielding love for Grace. One afternoon, as Grace slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, Eleanor set a plate of freshly baked cookies in front of her and sat down across from her. "Out with it, kiddo," Eleanor said, folding her arms. "What's got you looking like you lost a fight with a cloud?" Grace sighed, staring at the cookies but not touching them. "It's just, everyone expects me to be amazing. To be like her. But what if I'm not?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Not like her? Honey, you're the spit and image of your mother. Stubborn, passionate, and with a heart bigger than this whole town." "But I'm not her," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I'll never be as strong or brave as she was. I don't know if I even want to be." Eleanor reached across the table and took Grace's hand. "Listen to me, Grace. Your mother didn't expect you to be her. She expected you to be you. The strength you need isn't in trying to live up to her, it's in carving out your own path." Those words stuck with Grace, though it took years for her to fully understand them. In her late teens, Grace began to explore the world outside Willowbrook. Patricia, ever supportive, encouraged her to apply to colleges in cities far beyond the small town. Grace excelled academically, but it was her writing that truly set her apart. Inspired by her mother's incredible story, Grace began journaling about her experiences, the pressure of being a miracle baby, and the journey of finding her own identity. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. At the age of 19, Grace received a scholarship to study creative writing at a prestigious university in New York City. Patricia, though nervous about Grace leaving the close-knit safety of Willowbrook, knew that her niece needed this chance to grow. "I'm proud of you," Patricia said as she hugged Grace tightly at the bus station. "And your mother would be too." New York City was a revelation for Grace. The bustling streets, the towering skyscrapers, and the diversity of people and stories invigorated her in ways she had never imagined. For the first time, she was able to step out of the shadow of her mother's legacy and simply be herself. She poured her heart into her writing, crafting stories that wove together her small-town upbringing, her mother's miraculous journey, and her own struggles with identity. During her second year at university, Grace submitted a short story to a national writing competition. The story, titled 100 Years of Grace, was a fictionalized account of her mother's life and the miraculous circumstances of her birth. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. When the story won first place, Grace was catapulted into the literary spotlight. Publishers began reaching out, eager to hear more from the young writer with such a unique voice. Grace decided to write a memoir, a deeply personal exploration of her mother's life, her own journey, and the extraordinary bond they shared despite the short time they had together. The memoir, titled A Mother's Miracle, became a bestseller almost overnight. The success of the book brought Grace back to Willowbrook, where she found herself navigating the complexities of fame and family. The townsfolk, who had always adored her, now looked at her with a mix of pride and awe. But for Grace, the most meaningful part of returning home was reconnecting with the people who had shaped her life: Patricia, Lydia, and, of course, Eleanor. Eleanor, now in her 90s and still as sharp as ever, was thrilled to see Grace thriving. "Well, look at you," she said one evening as Grace sat with her on the porch of Margaret's old house. "A fancy New York writer. Your mother would be over the moon." Grace smiled, her eyes misting with tears. "I hope so. Everything I've done, it's because of her." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "She gave you the start, kiddo. But you've done the rest. And that's what makes her proud." As the years went by, Grace continued to write, her works touching hearts around the world. She became an advocate for women's health and reproductive rights, using her platform to share her mother's story and raise awareness about the complexities of motherhood, especially for older women. She often spoke about the incredible network of people who had supported her and her mother, emphasizing the power of community and love. In her late 20s, Grace returned to Willowbrook to open a small writer's retreat in her mother's old home. The retreat, aptly named Margaret's Grace, became a haven for aspiring writers, a place where stories were nurtured and dreams were realized. Grace herself continued to write, her voice growing stronger with each passing year. One summer evening, as Grace sat on the porch of her retreat, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She thought of her mother, of the incredible journey that had brought her into the world, and of the legacy of love and resilience that Margaret had left behind. "Thank you," she whispered into the fading light, "for everything." And in that quiet moment, Grace knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, a testament to her mother's strength, her own determination, and the enduring power of love. As the years passed, Grace's life blossomed into a tapestry of triumphs and trials. The retreat, Margaret's Grace, became a beacon for writers from all over the world. Aspiring authors, seasoned novelists, and even poets flocked to Willowbrook to work on their craft under the guidance of the woman whose stories had touched millions. Grace's workshops were as much about writing as they were about connecting with one's inner self, a skill she had honed while navigating the complexities of her own identity. But with success came new challenges. Grace found herself juggling the demands of running the retreat, publishing her own works, and maintaining her personal relationships. Patricia, who had been her rock for so many years, began to slow down. Though still sharp and witty, age had started to catch up with her. Lydia, now retired from her housekeeper duties, split her time between traveling with her daughter and visiting Grace at the retreat. One particularly rainy evening, Grace sat at her desk, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The words weren't coming as easily as they once had. Despite her success, she often felt the creeping pressure to live up to the expectations of her audience, much like the pressure she had felt as a child. She closed her laptop with a sigh and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to a photograph of Margaret holding her as a baby. "Still looking for advice, Mom?" she murmured to herself with a wistful smile. The next morning, Grace received an unexpected call from her publisher. They were eager for her to write another book, but this time, they wanted her to explore a new angle, her own journey of balancing her mother's legacy with her own life. The idea intrigued her, but it also terrified her. How could she dive even deeper into such a personal and vulnerable part of her life? To clear her mind, Grace decided to take a walk through the woods behind the retreat. The air was crisp, the scent of pine mingling with the faint aroma of blooming wildflowers. As she walked, she found herself reflecting on the past, on Margaret, Patricia, Eleanor, and Lydia. Each of them had shaped her in profound ways, teaching her lessons about strength, love, and perseverance. But there was one question that had always lingered in her mind. Was she living the life her mother had envisioned for her? The answer came in an unexpected way. As Grace rounded a bend in the trail, she stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin she had never noticed before. The structure was covered in ivy, its wooden walls weathered by time. Curiosity piqued, Grace stepped closer and peered through a cracked window. Inside, she saw a dusty typewriter sitting on a rickety table, surrounded by stacks of yellowed paper. It was as though the cabin had been left untouched for decades. Intrigued, Grace pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. She brushed away cobwebs and picked up one of the sheets of paper. The words were faded but legible, a poem about resilience and the beauty of life. She read it aloud, her voice echoing in the empty space. Even when the storm rages, the roots hold fast, and the blossoms return with the dawn. The poem resonated deeply with her, reminding her of her mother's enduring strength. Grace spent hours in the cabin, reading through the papers and uncovering more poems, short stories, and letters. It became clear that the cabin had belonged to someone who had also sought to leave a mark on the world through their words. The discovery of the cabin ignited a spark in Grace. She decided to restore it, turning it into an extension of Margaret's Grace. With the help of the townsfolk, many of whom remembered Margaret fondly, the cabin was transformed into a writing studio named the Writer's Haven. It became a sanctuary for retreat participants, a place where creativity and inspiration flowed freely. But the cabin also inspired Grace to embark on a new project of her own. She began writing a deeply introspective book, weaving together the stories of the people who had shaped her life and the lessons she had learned from them. The book, Roots and Blossoms, explored the interconnectedness of love, resilience, and the legacy we leave behind. As she worked on the book, Grace's life took another unexpected turn. during one of the retreat's workshops, she met Daniel, a historian who had come to Willowbrook to research small-town life for his own book. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful, with a knack for asking questions that made Grace think more deeply about her own work. Over time, their professional relationship blossomed into a close friendship and eventually, something more. Daniel's presence in Grace's life brought a new sense of balance. He encouraged her to take breaks from her work, to explore the world beyond Willowbrook, and to embrace the present moment. Together, they traveled to places Grace had only read about: Paris, Kyoto, the Scottish Highlands, each journey enriching her perspective and deepening their bond. Back in Willowbrook, Patricia's health began to decline. Grace, who had always leaned on her aunt for support, now found herself in the role of caretaker. The experience was both heart-wrenching and deeply fulfilling, as it gave her a chance to repay Patricia for the years of love and guidance she had given her. One evening, as Grace sat by Patricia's bedside, her aunt reached for her hand. "You've done more than I ever imagined, Grace," Patricia said, her voice soft but steady. "Your mother would be so proud of you. And so am I." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she squeezed Patricia's hand. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." Patricia passed away peacefully that night, leaving Grace with a profound sense of loss but also a renewed determination to honor her family's legacy. She poured her grief and gratitude into the final chapters of Roots and Blossoms, which was published a year later to critical acclaim. The book's success solidified Grace's place as a literary force, but more importantly, it brought her a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Through her words, she was able to share the lessons of love, resilience, and hope that Margaret, Patricia, and everyone else in her life had taught her. Years later, as Grace stood on the porch of Margaret's Grace, watching the sun set over the rolling hills, she felt a profound sense of peace. Daniel stood beside her, their young son playing in the yard. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with emotion. Daniel smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "She wouldn't just be proud. She'd be amazed." Grace nodded, her heart full as she gazed out at the life she had built, a life rooted in love and blossoming with possibility. Life continued to unfold for Grace in unexpected and poignant ways. As her retreat, Margaret's Grace, expanded its influence beyond Willowbrook, it became a hub for not just writers but dreamers of all kinds. People from all over the world came to seek solace, guidance, and inspiration in the quiet sanctuary that Grace had so carefully nurtured. But with its growing success came new challenges, ones that tested Grace's strength, her relationships, and the foundations of everything she had built. One of the first major hurdles came when a developer, William Arkwright, set his sights on Willowbrook. Arkwright was a slick, ambitious man with a reputation for turning quaint, historical towns into sprawling, modernized tourist attractions. His plans included a large resort and shopping district, which threatened to engulf the peaceful charm of the town. At the center of his proposed project was none other than the land surrounding Margaret's Grace. Grace first learned of Arkwright's intentions during a town meeting. The community center was packed with anxious townsfolk, their whispers filling the air like static. Eleanor, now in her mid-90s but still as fiery as ever, was the first to speak out when Arkwright presented his glossy brochures and slick PowerPoint presentation. "Over my dead body," Eleanor declared, standing with her cane clutched firmly in one hand. "This town doesn't need your fancy resorts or overpriced coffee shops. What it needs is to be left alone." Arkwright smirked, his polished demeanor unshaken. "With all due respect, ma'am, progress is inevitable. Willowbrook has the potential to become a destination city. Think of the economic opportunities." Grace sat quietly in the back, her hands clenched into fists. When Arkwright unveiled a map of his proposed development and the site of Margaret's Grace was marked as Future Expansion Area, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Rising to her feet, she spoke with a calm but firm resolve. "You can't erase history for profit," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This retreat isn't just a business. It's a tribute to my mother, to this town, and to the power of stories. Destroying it would be destroying something irreplaceable." The room erupted into applause, but Grace knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to stop Arkwright. Over the coming weeks, she and a coalition of townsfolk, led by Eleanor and Lydia, launched a full-scale campaign to protect Willowbrook. They organized petitions, rallied on social media, and reached out to journalists who could amplify their story. The fight against Arkwright's development became a national news story, drawing attention from activists, historians, and even celebrities. Grace was thrust into the spotlight once again, not as an author this time, but as an advocate for preserving the heart and soul of her community. The battle was exhausting, both emotionally and financially. There were moments when Grace doubted whether they could win, especially when Arkwright began offering lucrative buyouts to her neighbors. One night, as Grace sat in her office poring over legal documents, Daniel walked in with their son, Leo, in tow. The boy, who had inherited his mother's piercing blue eyes, ran to Grace and climbed onto her lap. "Why are you sad, Mama?" Leo asked, his tiny hands brushing her cheek. Grace managed a small smile, pulling him close. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just tired." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Grace. We'll fight together." Their unwavering support gave Grace the strength to keep going. The community's bond deepened as they united against the threat, drawing inspiration from the very legacy Grace had been trying to protect. Eleanor, despite her advanced age, became the campaign's fiercest spokesperson, delivering impassioned speeches that left even the most skeptical listeners nodding in agreement. Finally, after months of legal battles and public outcry, Arkwright's proposal was officially denied by the town council. The announcement was met with cheers and tears of joy as the townsfolk celebrated their victory. For Grace, it was a moment of triumph that felt deeply personal, a validation of everything she had worked for and believed in. But the ordeal left its mark. Grace realized how fragile her retreat and her vision truly were in the face of outside forces. Determined to safeguard her mother's legacy, she established a foundation in Margaret's name, dedicated to preserving not just Margaret's grace but also other historical and cultural landmarks in small towns across the country. The foundation became a new chapter in Grace's life, one that allowed her to expand her influence while staying true to her roots. As the years went on, Grace found herself reflecting more and more on the stories that had shaped her. She began compiling a collection of essays, each one exploring a pivotal moment in her life, from her miraculous birth to her fight to save the retreat. The collection, titled The Ties That Bind, was released to critical acclaim, cementing Grace's reputation as one of the most influential voices of her generation. Meanwhile, Willowbrook thrived in its quiet way. The retreat continued to draw visitors, its reputation bolstered by the town's victory against Arkwright. Eleanor, though slowing down, remained a beloved figure in the community, her sharp tongue and warm heart as vital as ever. Lydia, now in her 80s, became a mentor to younger women in the town, passing on her wisdom and no-nonsense approach to life. For Grace, life was a delicate balance of work, family, and community. There were still challenges. Leo's mischievous adventures often tested her patience, and the demands of running both the retreat and the foundation sometimes felt overwhelming, but there was also a deep sense of fulfillment. One evening, as Grace stood on the porch of the retreat, watching Leo chase fireflies in the yard, she felt the familiar ache of longing for her mother. She often wondered what Margaret would say if she could see the life Grace had built. "I hope I've made you proud, Mom," she whispered into the cool night air. In the stillness, she could almost hear Margaret's voice, warm and reassuring. "You have, my love. More than you'll ever know."